This case takes place in Afghanistan on the 19th of March 2015. Farkhunda was a 27-year-old woman who lived in the city of Kabul. In 2015, she became a volunteer teacher, and while she was volunteering, she studied Islam and Islamic law. She had dreams and ambitions of becoming a judge in Kabul. Farkhunda was described by those who knew her as brave and someone with strong convictions. If she believed something to be true, she would make her opinion be known, and she wasn't afraid of speaking her mind. The Afghan New Year marks the arrival of spring, and the day falls between March the 21st to the 22nd. On the 19th of March 2015, it was just 2 days before the New Year. Farkhunda and her family were making preparations for the celebration, and she promised her mother that she would help prepare for the festivities when she returned from her Quran reciting class. She said bye to her family and made her way to class. After the reading ended, she made her way back home with intentions of helping her mother with the preparations. However, on the way back, she decided to stop off at a shrine, which is located in the center of Kabul. After praying at the location, Farkhunda looked to her side to see someone selling small Islamic charms and small pieces of paper bearing Quranic verses. Farkhunda saw this as un-Islamic. She believed that the man should stop at once. She walked over and told this man that she believed what he was doing was wrong, and told him that she was going to go and speak to the caretaker of the shrine to get him removed. As soon as Farkhunda said this, the man began to shout. He screamed to the passers-by that Farkhunda was an American and she had burned the Quran. The man pulled out his mobile phone and began filming Farkhunda. She asked the man why he was lying and told him that she would never burn the book. The man just replied, "Why did you burn it?" Upon hearing the commotion, people began to gather round. The caretaker of the shrine, Zaiduddin, took some burned papers and added them to some old pages of a burned Quran. He showed this to the people outside of the shrine as proof that she had burned the Quran. This led to the people who had gathered becoming enraged. The police came and, realizing the danger that Farkhunda was in, told her to come with them right away to the police station so she could be taken to safety and so the situation could be dealt with in a professional way. The crowd were talking amongst themselves, getting angry at the thought of a woman burning the book. Despite the police telling Farkhunda to come with them right away before it's too late, she refused. She told them to bring female officers to escort her to the police station. Before Farkhunda could even fully explain the situation to those in the shrine, a member of the public grabbed her and dragged her outside. What happened next is far too graphic to show on YouTube. She was pushed to the ground. The mob then set about attacking her in a sickeningly brutal manner. She was punched, kicked, stomped, and jumped on. There are images of the attack that are widely available on Google. Her face is literally covered with blood, with dozens of people attacking her as hundreds gathered around and watched. The mob began to chant, "Kill her," as her veil was ripped from her head. In these moments, Farkhunda was captured looking up at the camera as she sat on the ground in a daze. Minutes into the savage attack, more police arrived on the scene and fired shots into the air. They made attempts to disperse the crowd, which worked but only for a few seconds. The mob were far too unruly. They wanted blood, and they wanted to kill Farkhunda. Some police then came up with the idea to pull Farkhunda up on a building to safety so the crowd wouldn't be able to reach her. 2 officers pulled her up, and it seemed that she would be safe at last, and finally free from the violent mob. As they pulled her up, a number of stones were striking Farkhunda in the head and body. This caused her to slip and fall, and she fell down towards the crowd again. The mob again began to beat her mercilessly. The police watched on as Farkhunda was jumped on, kicked in the face, and punched. She was then thrown into the road, where someone with a car ran her over. As this was happening, the police, instead of trying to stop the attack, began diverting traffic around the mob. Farkhunda was then dragged 300 feet to a riverbed, where the attackers began throwing large stones on top of her face. It's here where the mob decided to set her alight, although they soon discovered that the flames would quickly go out, This was because her clothing was totally saturated with blood. Upon realizing this, her clothing was removed. Some of the people in the mob then removed their own dry clothing and placed it over Farkhunda's body and used this to set her ablaze. There were more than enough people who were there who could have intervened and put an end to the violence, yet they chose not to. Farkhunda was killed beside the riverbed, and her body was discarded on top of a heap of rubbish. Hundreds of those at the scene had filmed the savage beating and uploaded the videos onto various social media sites. Farkhunda's family were told of the devastating news. Her mother remembers the day and said, "We went to the mortuary and I opened the plastic bag with the zip, and there I saw my daughter. I spoke to her, I cleaned her hands and her face. Her hands and face were bruised and badly burned." Some religious leaders and a couple of politicians came forward and stated that they supported the killing, claiming that those who carried out the attack were defenders of the faith and were righteous. They also made some false claims, stating that Farkhunda had burned the book so she would be granted citizenship in the United States. Authorities became worried that the support from prominent members of Afghan society would embolden the public to commit further acts upon Farkhunda's family. They were worried that her family too could fall victim to the mob, and so they were taken away to safety. News about the death spread quickly online, many commenters on the videos saying good riddance to Farkhunda and proclaimed that the killers did the right thing. An investigation was soon underway to uncover what exactly happened. The results caused a great deal of outrage. Only days after, it transpired that Farkhunda did not burn the Quran. There was literally no evidence to support any wrongdoing. Those who knew her also said that she would never, under any circumstances, burn the book. She was innocent and had been killed in a totally unprovoked attack. This led to a huge backlash. News of the gruesome lynching of an innocent woman became global news. The public became outraged and demanded answers. Why had Farkhunda been framed? Why did the police not do more to stop the attack? And why were so many people so eager to kill with no evidence of a crime? The religious leaders and officials who had once celebrated the murder retracted their statements, and in time the politicians were forced to resign from their positions. Literally overnight, Farkhunda went from being seen as a traitor worthy of the most brutal of deaths to a martyr. The funeral was soon held, and thousands of people attended the event. In the country, funerals are mostly only attended by men, and only men are allowed to carry coffins. But in this instance, women rebelled from the traditions and customs, and they demanded that they be allowed to carry Farkhunda's coffin and attend, and so they did. Demonstrations were led in the street, calling for justice for Farkhunda. Men and women of Afghanistan marched in solidarity, demanding answers and chanting, "We are all Farkhunda." Some protesters painted their faces red to mirror the image of Farkhunda's face bleeding and reenacted the murder. The authorities were forced to act as swiftly as possible. They went to work right away to find those responsible, and dozens of people were arrested and charged. According to some journalists who covered the case, there was an issue to overcome. The public demanded retribution for the murder of Farkhunda, but it wasn't clear just how involved people were. Some had thrown stones and kicked Farkhunda, but some had actually lit her body on fire. Finding who did what was tricky, and the public wanted extreme punishment for all of those involved, including the police who stood by and watched. It was likely that if harsh punishments were not handed down, the public could riot, but the court stated that they needed to be fair. The question arose, if someone had filmed the murder and not intervened, should they be put to death too? It was also never established at what point in the beating, dragging and burning Farkhunda actually died, so who exactly was responsible for her death was unclear. The police arrested more than 50 people, and 49 of those stood trial. Out of that 49, 19 were police officers. Many were shocked at the people who had committed these crimes. They assumed that those who were involved must have been violent thugs with violent pasts. However, it transpired that almost all of them were just regular people. There were young students, shopkeepers, and taxi drivers who had never even committed a crime before. The trial soon began later into the year. 7 of the 49 accused had defense lawyers, and none of those lawyers were notified about the date or time of the trial. Only 3 lawyers were present at the time of the trial, and none of them were given access to the prosecution's documents until the trial had started, so they were unable to prepare a defense for their clients. It took almost 2 days for the prosecutor to finish reading the 4,000 pages of documents detailing the murder of Farkhunda, and the defendants were allowed 3 to 5 minutes to give their defense. Some people who looked into the case saw this as somewhat of an injustice. They were worried that innocent people could have been thrown into the mix as a way to make it seem that the authorities had solved the crime. During the trial, it also came out that the police reinforcements had not arrived because the police pickup trucks had no fuel, and because some of their radios had not been working. Of the 30 civilian men tried in the case, 4 were sentenced to death, 8 were sentenced to 16 years in prison, and 18 were found not guilty or a lack of sufficient evidence. Of the police officers, 8 had their cases thrown out, and 11 were given the lightest penalty possible and were required to continue working. Of the 4 who were sentenced to death, all of them launched appeals, and all of them were given reduced sentences. Abdul Bashir, the man who had drove his vehicle over Farkhunda, was sentenced to death, but had his punishment reduced to 20 years in prison. Another was 17-year-old Mohammed Yaqub. He had thrown a large rock the size of a watermelon on Farkhunda's face and was filmed doing so. He had his death sentence reduced to 10 years in prison because the appeals court said that he was 17 at the time of his crime. Although his age is contested, some activists have disputed that he was underage at the time of the crime taking place and that he had documents faked to change his age from 20 to 17. Nevertheless, his sentence was still reduced. Zainuddin, the shrine's caretaker who had falsely accused Farkhunda of burning the book, had also been sentenced to death for the killing, but his sentence too was changed to life in prison, which in Afghanistan is around 20 years. When the results of these appeals became public, Farkhunda's family and many women's groups were outraged. Her mother said, "You saw that boy who hit her with that big stone, and the court said he is underage. Even if he is underage, he knew what he did, and he knows right from wrong." A coalition of women's groups organised under the banner of Justice for Farkhunda said, "It is obvious that justice has not been fairly done, and we are not satisfied with the verdicts at all." There are also some articles stating that some people who were filmed attacking Farkhunda were never brought to trial, due to them knowing people in high positions of power. Mob attacks are absolutely terrifying, and the case of Farkhunda is one that shook the country of Afghanistan and the world. It is tragic how those who carried out such a brutal crime received such lenient punishments. The controversy surrounding the case led her family to flee to neighbouring Tajikistan, where they still live to this day, furious at the numerous injustices surrounding the case of Farkhunda.